you're getting tonight is a talk that was one thing that is in the process of becoming another. I think it was Nanette, or maybe Amanda, who had asked me to talk about the railroads in Hardy for Homesteaders Day. And I was like, sure, not being an expert on railroads or Hardy, but knowing something about each one. And I did a lot of research for that talk, going back and reading a lot of old newspapers, because newspapers are so widely available now thanks to the internet. For those of you who are old enough, like I am, to remember having to look up rolls of microfilm, and especially anyone who did genealogical work, and to hand type footnotes. Doing historical research today often feels like you're cheating. There's so much that's available so easily. Of course, there's always that one thing that eludes you and you miss it. So this started as that talk on the railroads, but it's really becoming something that's much more about how Hardy, and I think we forget this sometimes, has always been a very different town. It has never been a typical Arkansas town, and so I'm going to work in a little bit of background on that as I move through. So just to say a little bit about sources, this is mostly pulling from newspapers. I've gone back and I've read all of the Hardy histories, so we're following that general outline. For those of you who know Hardy history well, there should be some repetition in here. I'll try to scrunch that down a little, but leave enough for folks who maybe not have heard the bigger story. But focusing in on some of the newspaper information that wasn't as readily or easily available when those earlier histories were written. But with the warning that means we're going to have all of the holes and unanswered questions that newspaper accounts always leave us with, because newspapers, especially in the 19th century, are incredibly biased, assume their readers know who people are already, and a variety of other things. So I want to start with this image as we talk about Hardy, and we see two very different seeming things here that they're from the same period on one page. On the left side, you see this great picture from the Shiloh Museum of what we would think of as the classic Ozark cabin. For those of you who are devotees, you know that's a single pin with a lean-to behind it. We see a very Ozark-looking family standing there. And partially because of what we see, but more even because of what we've been taught to see into this, we see isolation, but we also see individualism. We see self-sufficiency, and the idea that this family probably produces as many of the things it needs as it can, and raises a little bit of cotton to pay the taxes and buy coffee and sugar. On the other side, we see an early Sears and Roebuck catalog that represents, I would say, modernity coming into the region. That suddenly a world of mass-produced goods, new things, luxuries, things that aren't necessity, are intruded. Here at Hardy, we like to do a lot of what I have always called Ozarking, whether that is traditional music and the arts and crafts, or just getting out into the woods and feeling a little bit of space around you. Ironically, towns like Hardy, railroad towns, represent the end of that and will begin to be the death knell of those things. Because railroads were the disruptive technology of the 19th century. Roads in the early American Republic were terrible. They were not much better after the Civil War. Your worldview had been your community. There was a lot more truth to that self-sufficient family in those early days. Railroads create a national culture in the way that we think television or the internet has. The first thing that allowed information to pass from community to community to create national conversations, the first thing that made it worth it to manufacture products on a large scale was the railroad. If I owned a colonial factory, because they didn't use the term then, that would have consisted of me, the master craftsman, my wife and children, and if I was a big operation, 4 or 5 apprentices and journeymen, and we sold things within about a 2 days walk, and we only made them for order. You didn't make things on spec and have them stacked in shelves because it was viewed as a waste of materials. In fact, your market was so limited that in the early 19th century, later in other parts of the country, if you're on the East Coast, it is very often cheaper to put your goods on a boat and ship them to Europe than it is to put them on a wagon and go over horrible roads 50 or 100 miles inland. So your reach was limited, and if your reach is limited, the number of people you can sell to is limited. You're not making lots of things. With the railroad network, suddenly any person can reach thousands and thousands of people and sell in hundreds of communities. And so, industrialization, mass manufacturing become profitable for the very first time. Let me pull in a little bit. Here's a second image. Sadly, I could not find a better resolution. Let me just see how these are looking up here. Okay. You never know how these slides are actually going to look on the resolution of the photos till you see them. Amanda's nodding her head. Till you see them on the big screen. I was working on a small one. That black and white graphic in the center, you see Chicago at the base of Lake Michigan and this great spider web spreading out from it. Those three pictures you see there are from the three big American catalogs of the period. The Sears catalog, the Montgomery Ward, and the Spiegel catalog. We forget Spiegel a lot today. They're all three based in Chicago. Why? Because Chicago is the transportation hub. And this is where goods can spread out. And so, suddenly, things can be manufactured at a mass scale, distributed easily and cheaply up and down those railroad lines, and that is going to change employment. In the period that Hardy is founded, we will see the majority of Americans become wage workers, rather than the majority becoming urban, rather than being rural. And a lot of that is because of what the railroad makes possible. And towns like Hardy are the source of that kind of disruption. Now, does that mean things changed overnight? No. 50 years after Hardy was founded, people were still trapping and canning and plowing with mules. But year by year, the amount of self-sufficiency, the amount of things that are made in the home versus things that you tried to earn more and more cash so you could buy ready-made goods change. And that radically changes the nature of American life. If you go up and down the railroad tracks in Arkansas, you find towns like Hardy that were founded by the railroad and for the railroad. We're driving further down here. Ball Knob, founded about the same period on the Iron Mountain, about the same population, a lot of the same story, and you'll see that replicated many times, many ways across the country. And there will be ramifications for other towns, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. So, where does Hardy come from? Here's a map of Sharp County in 1880. If you like Arkansas place names, you can take a look at this and see the names of many places that either no longer exist or changed their names because, as Brooks Levins, who's the great historian of the Ozarks, has pointed out, we started cleaning up our act at the turn of the 20th century and changing the names of places like Greasy Creek and Possum Grape. Well, Possum Grape survived, but to things that sounded a little more prosperous and modern. 140 years ago, this was a largely empty valley with a few farmsteads in it. The most notable were the Walker family, who came here from Tennessee, according to family legend, to be in a place where slavery was less prominent. So we're going to list them as kind of the first of our dreamers and innovators of the night. Ash Flat, Evening Shade, those are older towns that have a more typical Arkansas and Ozark history in how they were settled, where people came from. You know, the family came from North Carolina through Tennessee, across the river, into Arkansas, went from hills to hills. It was all good. Or maybe came up from Mississippi after the war, looking for a fresh start. Those are the significant origin stories. Stay tuned. We're going to see that the origin stories for the people in Hardy, and most of these railroad towns, was quite different. You could say that Hardy was a cuckoo's nest planted, or cuckoo's egg put in the Sharp County nest by the railroads and by developers. The people who made the town were a variety of entrepreneurs, innovators, dreamers. Whether that's Walter Clayton, who only came from as far as Ash Flat, but risked everything and founded the town. The eminent Dr. Buford of Memphis, who founded the Wahpeton Resort and put the town on the map. Or a little bit further afield, W.S. Morgan, our local populist socialist agitator and writer who hailed from Ohio. There is a rich history of people wanting to do things a little bit differently in this town. So where's the railroad come from? We are a product of the Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Memphis Railroad, which was known by about 5 other names before it finally became the Frisco coming through town and the BNSF today. It's hard to imagine a world without highways, but as I said, you know how muddy things get today. I had someone across the street on Main couldn't get in the other day because their driveway over in Cherokee Village was too muddy. Imagine if that were the state of transportation everywhere. Railroads provided stable transportation that you could go on almost all of the time. By the 1880s, that grid across the country is reaching maturity. There's a little close-up further. You can see the Arkansas places. The names probably aren't coming across, but you can see how this line was coming across the north part of the state. It was the brainchild of a Kansas City railroad baron named George Nettleton. He was from Chicopee, Massachusetts. He worked his way up on the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, and then began engaging in the railroad business on his own behalf. And he had a dream of a 277-mile line that was going to connect Kansas City to Memphis. And you say, well, what's so grand about that? Well, for one, any of us who live on the tracks see how many trains are still coming down it the other day, so it's a route that remains a good idea. Previously, things have gone through to St. Louis. This is a route that is going to open up new territory for markets, but also significantly cut the distance that products, cattle, wheat primarily, coming out of the Midwest can make it down to Memphis and either into the railroad distribution network or onto boats, because Memphis is where you've always got water, and downstream to New Orleans to be shipped out to the wider world. He found ready backers in families like the Thayers of Boston. This is the era of the Gilded Age, and railroads today we have our tech billionaires, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg. These guys have nothing on the railroad barons of the 1870s, 80s, 90s. And these were people whose investments made huge returns. So let me just take a little detour. This is a photo of George Nettleton. This is the mansion he built for himself in Kansas City. It became a home for aged women when he died. With their profits from this and other railroads, this is the house that the Thayers built in Boston by the firm of Peabody and Stearns. This is divided up into 4 condo units now. One sold this year for $8.8 million. Here's the foyer, along with the ground plan, the plans of the first 2 floors. I think in a history association meeting, we can agree that whoever painted the wood in that foyer will answer for it on the day of judgment. But this was a very modern building, that it has a state-of-the-art fireproof silver vault in the back. It's got an elevator shaft running in the middle of the building. You can see the elevator is still there. It has very sophisticated hot water running to bathtubs on the floors of the bathrooms. This was a state-of-the-art house. These were the profits that railroads made for people. And so, again, you're part of this national network. So, the first leg of the railroad runs from Kansas City to Springfield, and after that it's built in 3 stages. There's one from Kansas City, heading toward the southeast. There's a route from Memphis, heading up northwest. And at Hoxie was already a stop on a major railroad. Jay Gould's Iron Mountain Railroad ran through Hoxie, and so crews for the new Kansas City Railroad began working both directions from Hoxie. A railroad camp is established here by 1880. This is one of those areas where I wish the newspapers were more complete. The Guard and the Sharp County Record, neither one gives an exact date. The earliest reference I can find is in about 1882, where it says James Hardy is back on the railroad north of town. But by 1883, there is a railroad camp established at a spring across the river, which I'm told is probably where Nanette's house is today.
Nearby?
Somewhere in that area. And these are rowdy places. Think about it. These are mostly young men. They're away from home. They're without supervision. They are being paid in cash, usually every week. And so there is plenty of money for liquor, for prostitution, for all those things. Not as many opportunities when you're still out in the camp in what was an isolated area. But they are moving along, building these beds, and then crews will come behind and lay the rails for them. This gives you an idea of the locomotives of that early period. We all probably know the story. James Hardy, who was the foreman of the camp, young guy from Batesville, saves the life of the supervisor from the guys who aren't happy about pay or something else. The man doesn't forget. The camp is already a mail stop that was called the Hardy Camp. When there comes time for the railroad to make for the post office to make a designation, the old supervisor, other people write letters, and so Hardy is named Hardy. As we all know, Clayton would have probably been a better, more accurate name. The other person beyond the railroad who saw the value here was Walker Clayton, who's the ancestor of at least one person, probably multiple ones here.
3.
I was going to say, I would get a show of hands, but I know it's several. He was an Alabama native. He and his family had settled in Ash Flat, where he had set up himself as a druggist. Pharmaceutical training is not something that was necessary in this period. You'll have to wait a little bit longer for regulation of drugs in America. In 1879, he'd obtained Ash Flat's first liquor license, which was a big deal. That's a lucrative thing in the period. And with a partner, he has a liquor and grocery business. But he sees the potential the railroad is going to bring. He knows that the stop that's going to be happening above Ash Flat is going to be the major market stop, not just for Sharp County, but for Fulton and Izard as well. And likely bets his life savings acquiring land in this area. So, at only 35, he risks it all. By tradition, he walks off the plat for the town himself. He donates the land for the cemetery, for the church, for the school, in the best tradition of town founders. That was one of the things that's kind of standard. And he never stops promoting Hardy. He will be an ice house owner. He will be a railroad tie contractor. He will be the president of the bank, the president of the telephone company, and the founding secretary of the Masonic Lodge. He kept investing, kept taking risks, usually that paid off, sometimes that didn't, right up until his death. And so we have in him this classic kind of Arkansas town founder who straddles the period from something that is a speculative dream to, by his death, something that is a fairly prosperous town, especially by Ozark standards. Hardy grew rapidly. Clayton became one of the principals of a new firm called Clayton & Coat that dealt in general merchandise and liquor. His younger brother, Will, opened one of the 2 saloons in town in that period that had a very popular pool table that turns up periodically in the Sharp County Record. By Halloween of 1883, the new line is complete, and a car special train celebrating the completion goes from Kansas City to Memphis. 18 months later, by April of 1885, we have an account that lists 9 businesses on Main Street facing the railroad. The railroad keeps improving and adding to its facilities. They add a sidetrack, a warehouse to the depot area, and the railroad's holdings in this period are going to be worth about $2 million just in Sharp County. The town is served in this period by 2 passenger railroads a day. But where there is grief, not everything is a fixed sum, so that where one person profits, others suffer. But there was definitely suffering created in other parts of the county and the other towns because of Hardy's rapid success. Ash Flat loses merchants who move here. Highland shrinks to the point that it loses its post office. In 1893, when Hardy's only 10 years old, Evening Shade will have to share its status as a courthouse center with Hardy. And so, when we think about the paving of Highway 63 in the mid-50s, the moving of the courthouse back to Ash Flat, we can say that we benefited from one mode of transportation, And we suffered when another was invented, and maybe there is a little justice in giving something back to Highland Ash and Ash Flat, and I guess Evening Shade will have to wait to get its due. One of the most interesting things to look at, I love census data, is how Hardy population does not look like the population of other Arkansas towns because of the railroad. For instance, 1900 census, there are 59 households listed in Hardy. Of these, 37 had a resident whose personal origins or their parents' origins were from a state outside of the wider South. That's, 63%, almost 2/3 of people had some family tie outside of the South. This, I went through that standard North Carolina, Tennessee to Arkansas, which is, the stereotypical version. There's also the we came to Kentucky and then to Arkansas version. But this was not normal. Illinois and Ohio are two of the best represented states for people. We also have people who have family ties to Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Kansas. And even those who come from the South come from places that aren't often where you expect for Arkansas. So we have people who have come from Texas, people who have come from Louisiana. And that's even probably an undercount because I'm counting households here. We have a lot of boarding houses in town, hotels, and those disproportionately hold people who are even more likely to be from out of state. So, comparison. In Evening Shade, only a quarter of people have a tie to anyone outside of the South. That's about the same for Salem. In addition to the small town occupations you'd expect here, like physician, teacher, blacksmith, we have 16 railroad workers. For the other towns that don't have any, we have 14 salesmen. So that puts more than 1/3 of the town's men in some highly mobile position where they are moving around or have moved around, who've been widely exposed to a wider world than most people have been. Evening Shade and Salem only have 4 salesmen each, and most of them you can tie back to a local store. They're non-traveling salesmen. Flip side, in Hardy, only 7% of people with a profession listed are farmers or farm laborers. That's 1/3 of what you find in Evening Shade. I didn't have time to count up Salem tonight. There were 26 boarders in private houses or hotels living in Hardy in 1900. Evening Shade, there are only 6. In Salem, there are 11. Here, 51% of people are renters. Evening Shade, Salem, 2/3 of people are homeowners. That's a lot of numbers. But what it says is not just this is a new town. These are people who are newly arrived to a region, people who are hoping to raise themselves up with new opportunities, and that gives us a little bit different look than a lot of places are going to have. It also means that the people of Hardy, on average, had a wider experience of the nation and what was happening than people did in most towns. My family settled in Big Flat in the 1830s. And let me tell you, it was a long time before news of very much came to Big Flat, which, you had to fight your way out of the woods for a long time from Mountain View or Mountain Home to get there. Hardy's growth did not come without its cost. Angelia has all my good murder stories that I found along the way. Ask Angelia to hear about some of the wilder stories, but just to talk a little bit about what the railroads brought to us. Right off the bat, a local drayman, Lewis Billingsley, whose headstone is pictured here. His wagon was hit by the train. A deaf man also was hit in the early years. A young man lost both of his feet on the railroad tracks. 4 visiting or local brakemen died. Being a brakeman, especially when you're up on the top, spinning the brake wheels, was a very dangerous profession. One of them being John Edgar Beck, the well-known Beck family, whose house was a monument here for years. Another, John Groves, a local guy who was killed while he was in Missouri, leaving a wife and a 1-year-old baby. It was also a wild place. This is a judge from the Earnhardt Distillery in Batesville. Shout out to my friend Jill Earnhardt, I went to college with at Lyon. We all have our family myths. Hers was the family fortune went away because great granddaddy kept riding his private train car to fight prohibition. Whatever the truth of that, they were certainly selling their product in Sharp County. We also had a distillery in the county, and we had plenty of whiskey consumption here. I've already told you about the houses, but about the saloons in town. But in a place that is liminal, there aren't long-standing ties. There are not long-established institutions. They're always a little wilder. It's a town that's disproportionately male, disproportionately young, and that leads to expected consequences. It's going to take a few years before the school and our single union church to have much of a hold on community behavior. And even then, the signs of conventional respectability are weak. There's a great 1891 newspaper account decrying that preaching in the church is down to once a month and people hardly come to Sunday school at all. That contrasts with Ashflat, Edenshade, Salem, all supporting multiple churches and minister in this period. Williford, Bradenton as well. Hardy was a renegade in that aspect. Court records, newspaper records show us a whole lot of accounts of disturbing the peace, public drunkenness, and yes, the occasional shooting in cold blood on the street. In fact, the first time Hardy makes it into the national press is in 1887, when a young brakeman named Charlie Burke tries to settle down 4 drunk passengers who are Hardy locals who get on the train there headed north. Scuffle ensues. Charlie is stabbed through the heart and dies instantly. His murderer, killer, whichever, is acquitted 2 weeks later in a local hearing here. The national papers, because of course this is a railroad man that's being killed, you're raising the ire of all the railroad unions, say that, this was a travesty where the supporters of the killer were brandishing guns and making threats in the back. The Evening Shade paper says this wasn't the case, but doesn't give any facts to dispute that, which I know from my own reading, the Cersei Daily Citizen probably tells you that the other accounts were closer to fact. An interesting aside, as I was digging through this, there's a Romeo and Juliet aspect of this story I hope to dig through a little more. At one point, as I was searching for more information on Charlie Burke in the Gazette, and you see this headline down here, took strychnine. A couple weeks after he dies, there's a young woman who has recently moved into a brothel there, or a house of ill fame, as the paper calls it, who calls herself Nellie Burke, and she drinks strychnine, dies. Do not ever kill yourself with strychnine. It takes a long time and it's very painful. So as she's in the death throes, she confesses that Burke isn't the name. It was the name of the young man, the young brakeman, Charlie Burke, who was her lover, who has jilted her and thrown her over. So in this Romeo and Juliet turn, it appears, Charlie disappeared. The young woman thinks she's been abandoned and she takes strychnine and dies. I haven't been able to tie all that back together. And it's the nature of things that you just may never be able to, but it's tantalizing. So, in short, Hardy was an absolutely normal, rowdy railroad town where railroad workers, traveling salesmen could find all the usual diversions that they expect. But even when we're in this rowdy period, Hardy is also developing another audience. As early as 1885, the Kansas City and Springfield Railway puts out a sportsman's guide to their new railroad, extolling all the places to hunt and to fish. Soon, Little Rock papers, Memphis papers are full of stories about sportsmen from not just Little Rock and Memphis, Kansas City, many other cities, coming to Hardy in the area around it to hunt and fish, eventually just to enjoy the outdoors. Finally, in 1906, how many of you know the story of Wahpeton? The magic train breaks down. Dr. Buford, his wife, get off the train, use the delay to walk up the hill, decide this looks like a pretty good place, and end up buying the hill. The first big piece from Walker Clayton. It always comes back to Walker Clayton. and eventually founding the Wapaton Inn, which will become a major source for tourism. They will be followed by many other Memphians who will buy property on their own, become regular visitors to Wapaton. They will sell after the inn burns to Judge Guthrie, who becomes a Memphis judge, another inveterate promoter. This is the Guthrie House that sold recently, who will build the second inn, that rock structure that we've all seen the pictures of. The Rio Vista colony up the river is founded in the 1930s. And these people are going to go through an amazing level of amusement, which is often quite contrary to our rusticating Ozark image. Bridge parties, dances with orchestras, a regular fox hunt, which I'm told that the fox was never caught, but a lot of whiskey was drank, following the town tradition. And then, of course, we'll have all the summer camps that will follow, the YMCA, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, and a summer home for the orphanage, the Memphis Orphanage of the Episcopal Church, along with a summer chapel, St. Mary in the Woods, that will serve people. All of these were chronicled by the society pages of the Commercial Appeal and the Arkansas papers and the papers of North Mississippi. You don't expect it, but we featured, like the Hamptons, in the society pages in those years. We're counting who was visiting here, who was staying. Most prominent among them, Boss Crump, whose family would spend the summer here, and he quite frequently joined in. This is a great ad that I have not. Has anyone seen this ad before? I'm looking for a date for this ad so I can get the full version. But that is a full-page ad called The Highway to Hardy that appeared in the Memphis Commercial Appeal, showing what kind of outreach was done to keep people coming. If you look back at that other slide, oops, if I figure out which direction I'm going, you can see vacation, bathing, boating, fishing, Ward's Summer Resort, and then the Highway to Hardy. Hardy has always benefited. Let me say this, it's not just people know about Hardy and they love it. When Hardy has been most successful, Hardy was being aggressively promoted with some really sophisticated media for its area. There's a little piece on the fox hunt. Standard little society page clipping that says, a visitor who recently returned from the Wapaton Inn and the mountain resort of Hardy, Arkansas, reports seeing several attractive Memphians there. Among them, Mildred Eddington, who frequently visits the Rogers Caldwells, being more striking looking than ever and supporting a swell summer tan. Margaret Dewey and her mother, Mrs. Henry Pratt, and other members of the family enjoy the swimming and mountain sports, and Dale Guthrie, who has prom-trotted his way up, was, according to one informant, the prettiest thing here. A little frivolous sounding for what you say. We were so important in this period that in addition to the regular trains, the Kansas City, Florida Special stopped here. This was the crown jewel of the Kansas City, Florida line. This is the lounge car. You can see this was not for stock cars, for traveling salesmen trying to get by. This was a luxury liner. It did not stop in small towns, but by special arrangement, it made regular stops in Hardy because of the economic attainment of the people who were staying here. So, quite something. Here's a timetable for the Frisco Railroad, which has become at this time. We see the decline of the town. We were created by one means of transportation, as I said at the beginning. We were undone by another. Highways not only gave people an alternative route of transportation, they fundamentally changed the way we vacation. Rather than going someplace to get out of the weather in a world that was increasingly air-conditioned, now destination travel became the norm. We're going to pack up the kids and go to the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or to the beaches, fill it in. Or people making shorter trips that hurt long-term results like Wapaton. Of course, all of the cabins there in Rio Vista were sold off for individual ownership in this period. Last passenger service to Hardy ended in 1967. Today, closest you can go to jump a train is to Walnut Ridge, where the Texas Eagle passes by going north 3 nights a week and south 3 nights a week in the middle of the night. I have taken that train from Chicago when I was living in the upper Midwest, and I was like, I want to see the train through Arkansas. All the train through Arkansas is dark, very dark. And our closest stop being one of the darkest. So, to close out with one last slide. The car changed the way we suffer. It changed the kind of traffic. But today, bed and breakfast, Airbnbs, RV parks once again serve tourists who've been coming here a century or who are making their first visit. The sidewalks of the historic district are full in the summer. People still come here to follow their dreams, whether that's in real estate, always a traditional Hardy dream, antiques, holistic health and crystals, or in making art. And so once again, Hardy lives on in the midst of vacation, but Hardy has always been different. Restless people coming from many places. It's very easiest for us to think, everything changed when those people came to Cherokee Village. If you look back far enough, there's a 50% chance your family origins are the same as the people in Cherokee Village. I should say the treats came to Arkansas, my branch, from Indiana by way of Connecticut. Anytime I wanted to make people mad at a family reunion, I just had to say that. I think I'm not the only person who understands how that is. And so it's not simply Cherokee Village and retirees. It's not just all the people who moved in for antique stores and art in the 80s. This town has been different from the very beginning. Whether it was Walker Clayton, who was someone who was close, who had a big idea, whether it was the Bufords, on down the line, Hardy has always stood out, and not simply, I feel something different here. You can look at the demographics, you can look at the type of employment, the type of business, and know that Hardy is different from most Arkansas towns. And it's been proud of that and capitalized on it. And at a time when you drive through town after town in Arkansas and you see every single storefront empty, to see a place where everyone is full and we have people chomping at the bit to try their hand at some new business in the storefronts that are available. We're very lucky. I've been here 7 months now. I could not be happier or feel more lucky. So let me end by just saying thank you to everyone for the welcome to Hardy. It's a pleasure to live here.